Welcome back, everyone, to episode 12 of the Space City X-Files. I'm glad you decided to join us today because we have a very fascinating case for you today. On this episode, we'll be going over the true events that took place in a CIA operation known as Project MK Ultra. Now, over a span of 20 years, the CIA would administer psychoactive drugs to unknowing individuals to see how effective they can be in controlling someone's mind. Now, these tests were performed on all types of people, from prisoners, students, at hospitals, and even on their own agents. If it already sounds hard to believe, I'm right there with you. I mean, my government couldn't possibly do things like that to me, right? Well, let's see how you feel at the end of the case. Let's listen to all the details. This is MK Ultra. Before we get started, a few quick announcements. Space City X-Files appreciates the support you give us week in and week out. And what we've been able to accomplish so far would not be possible without you. If you'd like to know how you can support the show, there are three main ways, and I'll give you the details now. The first way is, if you would like to support the show by becoming a member, you can go to our website and click on the Patreon tab. And once there, it gives you the option to sign up for a $5 or $10 a month membership. And with that, you get unreleased full episodes, access to our private Discord group, and free merchandise that will drop on you randomly. Secondly, if you're not ready for a monthly subscription, that's okay. If you would like to make a one-time donation, on our website, there's also a support us with the tip tab, and there you can type in whatever amount you want. 50 cents, $1, to $5, whatever. It's all appreciated the same. And because we're dedicated to elevating the quality of the program, all proceeds will always go back into the show to benefit our final product. Okay? I promise this money is not going in our pockets, and we're not going to the local 7-Eleven to buy some Four Locos. I promise you that. The last and most effective way to support the show is to leave us a review after you listen, wherever you're listening. And I can't say how important this is. With your feedback, we can improve our show, and we can bring in new listeners, which is priceless. So one last plug, our show store is also available on the website, and it's stocked with hoodies, tees, stickers, all kinds of stuff, and that helps support the show also. And that concludes the announcements. And before I get started to the main story, I'd just like to say I've been sick for the last week, so if I sound like crap, I'm sorry, I apologize. I should be better by next week. Alright, so one of the main reasons for covering MK Ultra is because I feel like it has a lot to do with last week's episode called the Montauk Project. Now, if you didn't get a chance to listen to episode 11, I highly recommend that you go listen to that one first, because it gives precedence to what we'll be talking about today. But quickly to recap the Montauk Project, there was an electrical engineer named Preston Nichols who, through repressed memories, discovered that he and his friend had been brainwashed of their roles in human experiments on abducted kids and the homeless. The experiment would supposedly take place in an underground military bunker at Montauk Air Force Station. Now, these experiments that Preston Nichols talked about involved the military attempting to control the minds through radio waves and other avenues. It also involved an attempt to harness and increase the psychic ability of people by having them sit in a machine or possibly do psychoactive drugs. Preston would also claim they were pretty much successful in all their attempts, and they even found a way to time travel and communicate with aliens. So Preston and his friend would have their memories wiped after they grew a conscience and attempted to sabotage the project. Now, as we discussed last week, because of the claims in the Montauk Project were so wild and so far-fetched, people usually fell on two sides of the fence. Now, either they believed it or they didn't. So the problem with the Montauk case, supposedly the government used private shell companies to do most of the work, so there was just not a lot of evidence to trace anything back to the U.S. government. Now that we got that covered, let's investigate MK Ultra and see if there are any similarities. So in the onset, we talked briefly about what MK Ultra was. But it's really important to know why and how these ideas came to be in the first place. So let's look at the origins on where the idea of mind control came from. So during the Second World War, the Axis allies were known to experiment on prisoners of war. The Japanese and Germans conducted many experiments, and what the U.S. started to notice was that some of the prisoners began to adapt the ideology of the foreign enemies. It was like they were being brainwashed, and in turn, they did not want to return home after the war was over. Now, war is hell, but I can't say for sure that's what happened. Okay, this is all just what we're hearing from testimony. The human mind, though, can only take so much. And if you're beat and drugged enough, then sure, you can probably get someone to do something outside of what they would normally do. So, in 1951, the United States, this is after the war was over, the United States recruit the help of Japanese and German scientists and pretty much say, we're going to pardon your war crimes in return for your help. And shortly after, they begin Project Artichoke. And the goal here was to see if they can reprogram someone into the perfect assassin. So, to achieve this, they felt they needed to make the person completely void of any conscience and any regard for their life or the life of others. And this is where they began to experiment with the drugs. The CIA wasn't all out testing on unsuspecting Americans yet. At this point, what they would do is they would travel to allied countries and test the experiments on POWs that were incarcerated there. Now, in an article, it's reported they were targeting the weak and poor and someone who may be more susceptible mentally. And they would basically interrogate them while, unbeknownst to the subject, administer some type of drug. It started with cocaine, then marijuana, then peyote, and mescaline. But when they finally come to LSD, the effects appear to give them exactly what they're looking for. The CIA, along with other intelligent branches of the armed forces, fall completely in love with LSD. Now, they claim that this is the drug that's going to change the game in terms of interrogation. Somewhere along the line, though, the CIA finds out that the Soviets are also experimenting with LSD. And at that time, the relationship between the two powers was a rocky one. So the United States was like, hell no. And they go and they buy up all the LSD known to be around at that time. It's reported that they buy so much LSD, they could dose the whole population of America if they needed to. And who's to say they didn't? I mean, we could all be living in one big acid trip right now. So at that point, it appeared Project Artichoke was a success. Were they ever able to create that brainwashed assassin, though? Well, let's keep going. The other details will explain that. So, 2 years later, Project Artichoke would give way to MK Ultra. And this is where the train starts to go off the rail. Okay, so MK Ultra would be headed up by the mad scientist that was brought in to organize the previous Project Artichoke. Now, when you think about the qualifications of someone, when the type of qualifications someone would have to have in order to subject people to days and days of drugging, to authorize mental and physical torture day after day, now you would imagine it had to be somebody pretty sick and twisted, right? I mean, imagine if you saw a photograph of this person. It would probably look like the epitome of evil, right? But in the case of Sidney Gottlieb, the mastermind, it wasn't. And it was very odd for Gottlieb to end up in the position he did. Since the CIA usually drafted the Ivy League type, I mean, Gottlieb came from humble beginnings. He grew up in the Bronx. He didn't go to an Ivy League school. He went to the University of Arkansas. And after he did a couple of years there, he eventually transferred to Wisconsin University. And then he finally ended up in a California technical school. But that's still a far cry from the Princeton, Yale, Harvard degrees that normally fill out the intelligence agencies. Well, it turns out that he just knew the right people, and he was a brilliant man. Since a former teacher of his who happened to be taking on a project in biowarfare, he ended up recommending him to Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA. So, fresh off the success of Project Artichoke, Gottlieb would now be charged with a new task, and this one, sticking with the goal of controlling the mind, The government wanted to find a way to develop procedures and identify drugs that can be used in interrogations to weaken individuals and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture. So, in a sense, they went from trying to make a covert hypnotized killer to trying to figure out if they can frame someone. And keep in mind the supposed purpose for this. At this time, WW2, World War II, had just ended, but the Cold War now begins. So, the U.S., fearing an imminent showdown with the Soviet Union, started this research for mind-controlling techniques because it was reported that the Soviet Union already had this capability and were using it on their own people. So here comes the old USA following suit. Now, there have been numerous reports on how it all went down and took place, but because the CIA director ordered all documents about the project destroyed before a committee could subpoena them, all we have to go off of is finance records and sworn testimony. It's important to mention this now because I won't be following any particular order on what took place and when. It's more important to just know it happened, okay? So we'll start off with how the CIA tested these techniques on patients. So what the CIA did was they started to reach out to psychiatric hospitals and prisons and free clinics, and they would be like, hey, look, we know that you already have the people coming in who have problems. Well, we have something here that we want to experiment with so we can study the effects on how they react to it. Now, of course, they didn't tell them the side effects, and the people involved didn't really know to ask. So slowly, they start to introduce the psychoactive drug, LSD, to people who already had issues, mental issues and drug issues and all kinds of issues. And the experiment basically went like this. They would drug the people heavily on LSD and try to wipe out who they were as a person. When the patient started to refuse or try to opt out, they would lure them back in by offering them any drug of their choice they wanted as a con to continue. And I mean, they would give them anything from marijuana to cocaine and even pure heroin. So of course, the addict would continue on. And not really surprising, by the time the test subjects were released, some went completely psychotic. Some just flat out died, while others were left with deep emotional scars that never healed. When one subject who was drugged daily over a period of 177 days was asked what he remembered from the trial, he couldn't recall a damn thing. He said his memory was just a haze. In the case of two women who were visiting one of these clinics for postpartum depression, one doctor says, okay, we're going to try to treat you with hypnosis and see if we can alleviate these issues from you in this way. Although, while under hypnosis, they were given heavy doses of LSD and were played recordings over and over again in their headphones. In this case, one woman was instructed in her recording that when she hears a key word, she is to try and wake the other woman up. If the other woman does not wake up, she is to go into a rage, pick up the gun next to the sleeping woman, and shoot her in the head. They then stop the recording on the earphones and bring the two women slightly out of the hypnotic state. They then issue the trigger word over the loudspeaker, and sure enough, the woman stands up, walks over to the sleeping woman, and lightly shakes her. When the sleeping woman does not wake up, this sends her into a rage, and she picks up the purposely unloaded gun, points it at the sleeping woman's head, and pulls the trigger without any thought. Now, as soon as she pulls that trigger, she falls to the ground in a deep sleep and does not come out of it until she's woken by the physician. When they ask the women what they remember, they can remember nothing at all. And many of these crazy tests went on for years, and sadly, they even tested the LSD on unsuspecting veterans at the local veterans hospital. Now, in this case, when they found out what was going on, they were able to sue the CIA, and in some cases, not all of them, were able to collect a settlement. Of course, that means jack shit to the people who were treated like guinea pigs. Now, one of the most notable people who were treated at these free clinics was Charles Manson. It's thought that Manson, a barely literate hippie, found his technique of dosing his followers with LSD from a Dr. West who was heading up a free trial clinic in San Francisco, the very same place Manson and his followers happened to be before they headed off to Los Angeles. Now, also while in San Francisco, the CIA initiated a sub-project connected to MKUltra called Operation Midnight Climax. Now, in this test, the CIA would basically set up prostitute houses, and they would bring in businessmen and high-profile people off the street. Now, once in the room, the sex worker would go to the restroom, and they would spray aerosol LSD into the room, causing the suitor to start tripping. Now, once he was deep into the effect of the drug, the CIA would be on the other side of a one-way mirror, and then the sex worker would then start trying to extract classified information from the subject. Now, they even went into detail as to what kind of sex act combined with LSD happened to be the most effective. In this particular case, they even started to dose their own agents without them knowing they were being experimented on. Now, the agents wouldn't say anything or tell anyone because they would be too embarrassed once they figured out their coworkers just watched them cheat on their wives with a prostitute. Now, if you're thinking, wow, this is super screwed up, this is only the beginning. So, the CIA then set their sight on colleges in the early 60s, and many astute Ivy League colleges in particular were found to be working along with the MKUltra project. Harvard University was a main contributor to the MKUltra treatments. It was said that a psych professor dosed many unwitting students with heavy concentrations of LSD and then subjected the students to harsh interrogations in attempts to strip the person of the characteristics that make up their personality. It was said that during the interrogations they would also try and break the pupils of their beliefs as well. So if the subject happened to be a spiritual person who believed in God, the goal was to try to make them admit that there was no God. Now, what blew my mind was when I found out the name of one of the students who had admitted to being a test subject of the MKUltra experiments. Now, you may recognize the name Ted Kaczynski. And that's right, the Unabomber himself was a test subject of MKUltra. Now, in Ted's second year of college, he became part of a psychological experiment conducted by a man named Henry Murray. In Murray's test, he had the students write essays about their personal beliefs and aspirations, and then he would have someone berate and verbally abuse them for the things they believed in, day after day after day. Now, at some point, drugs and other hypnosis techniques were brought in, but for 3 years, Ted would be in this program. Now, some sources would say that it's a possibility these tests contributed to his criminal activities, but I'll just come out and say that it most definitely had something to do with it for sure. Now, you can believe what you want, but Ted was already an awkward young man, and you add this illegal experiment to the mix for 3 years. How could you not say it didn't cause emotional damage? Now, this madness would continue for a long time, testing on colleges, but eventually, because of the growing popularity of recreational LSD use, the CIA decided to turn their focus elsewhere. So it turns out that LSD actually freed people's minds instead of causing it to be controlled. Now, once people started to experiment on their own, the rage against authority and encouragement for people to think outside the box really started to become prominent in the 60s. In fact, many anti-government activists grew in popularity from this point. People like Timothy Leary, a Harvard professor who started his own work with LSD and psilocybin mushrooms. Allen Ginsberg, the American poet. Ken Casey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Robert Hunter, the lyricist, who is most known for his work with Jerry Garcia's Grateful Dead, were all said to have been part of the MKUltra experiments at one time. So the crazy thing is, this has not been the only time when the U.S. government has been accredited with the beginning of a drug culture, okay? Because some would make the case that the CIA was also responsible for introducing crack cocaine to the gangs in the California area in the 1980s. Of course, though, no evidence can be found to support the claims, which is the same as the case of the MKUltra. So it's important to remember that all the files of MKUltra were ordered to be destroyed by the CIA director at the time. The only reason why some files were preserved was because they happened to be stored in the wrong area, and no one knew they were there except the whistleblower who placed him there. Had it not been for those records, the MK Ultra project likely would have been denied altogether. Well, let's wrap this up with the case of a CIA agent, Frank Olson. Now, Frank was a biological warfare scientist, and he'd been working on Project Artichoke before coming to help on MK Ultra. And so it's November 18th, 1953, and a small group of the CIA, who all happened to be working on MK Ultra together, decided it's time for a little getaway to a rural area called Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. Now, as it begins, the retreat is going as planned. Okay, nothing out of the ordinary. But on the second night, which would be the 19th, Frank Olson and a few of his other associates are served glasses of Contro. Now, these glasses were laced with LSD, and it was at the order of Sidney Gottlieb, as a way to kind of bring these guys in on the experiment. Now, you may be asking, why do this to your own men? And under the guise, Sidney would reply, so they can determine if the supposed truth serum, LSD, could make an agent divulge confidential information. But you know what? In Frank Olson's case, I think it's a little more than that. You see, Frank's been around for a long time. You know, he's done a lot, he's seen a lot, and he's heard a lot of stuff. He was involved with biological warfare tests on animals, and his son accounted that this took a toll on his dad's psyche. Now, eventually during Project Artichoke, Frank starts accompanying the CIA to the safe houses where he witnesses the interrogation and death of many POW using the MK Ultra procedures and other torture tactics created through the Project Artichoke. It's reported that he was also aware that the U.S. was using germ warfare against the enemies, which the U.S. denied, of course. Now, anyways, we find out through a journalist named Gordon Thomas that Frank, after feeling like he may be done with the whole spy game, he started to talk to a British psychiatrist who was qualified to see and talk with U.S. agents. Now, after Frank expresses to him some of the things that are bothering him, the doctor immediately relays to Gottlieb that Frank should now be considered a security risk and that his entrance into military bases should be limited. Now that you have this knowledge here, doesn't the timing of a so-called retreat seem kind of suspicious? Well, let's hear the rest of Frank's story. So, it's reported that Frank has a very bad trip on this LSD, and I can almost guarantee you that he received the most potent dose. So if you're not familiar with the effects of LSD, to put it short, you can either have a very pleasant, blissful experience, or you can have the worst nightmare you've ever had materialize and make you feel as though you're experiencing it in real life. Now, also, depending on if you had any predisposed mental issues, it could cause psychosis that some people can never come out of. So after dosing Frank, he just can't shake off the depression that followed his acid trip. And it's not reported what they did during the experiment. For all we know, they were probably subjected to some horrifying shit. You know, all it says is that he was dosed. They never say what happened to him during the rest of the time where he was there. So, the next day on the 20th of November, Frank returns home, and his family immediately knows something's wrong with him. Okay, so Frank won't talk, he won't eat. I mean, he sure as hell is not talking about the trip. The only thing that's mentioned is that when he and his wife are alone later that night, he looks at her and he simply says, "I've made a terrible mistake." Now, 3 days later, Monday the 23rd, Frank and his boss, Vincent Ruitt, returned to work still noticeably shaken from the LSD dosing that had happened the week before. Now, Ruitt testifies that Frank approached him and asked if he should quit or if Ruitt is going to fire him. Like, apparently, he didn't care which one happened. He was just done. And now, this is just one man's account of things, okay? It's not like poor Frank is around right now to defend himself or say what really happened. I mean, who really even knows if Ruitt was even dosed himself? I mean, he could have just been pretending for all we know. So, Ruitt further testifies that he is able to calm Frank down that day, but the problem only intensifies the next day on the 24th, and a co-worker of Frank's named Josh Stubbs ends up having to take him home only after a few hours of being there. Now, it's reported that Frank told his wife that day that Josh was there because they were afraid that Frank would hurt his family. So Frank agrees, okay, I'm going to go see a doctor. So they fly to New York with another associate put in charge over watching Frank. And this is a CIA chemist named Robert Lashbrook. So Frank and Robert arrive in New York to meet up with the CIA-affiliated psychiatrist named Harold Abramson. Now, this is kind of shady too, because Dr. Abramson is later found out to be a main player in administering the LSD and providing the observations for MK Ultra on the New York side. So Dr. Abramson sees Frank, and I'm guessing he's able to make some progress, but he wants to continue to see Frank, so he tells Frank to stay in town to go get a room, and the next day they're going to continue the therapy. Well, that night at 2 a.m. on the 28th of November, Frank would supposedly jump from his 10th-story hotel room and fall to his death. And this is not an open and closed case, okay? There are many suspicious things that linger around Frank's death. Now, one was the doorman heard the thud outside, and he runs outside to see what it was. So upon finding Frank on the floor, he says Frank was trying to tell him something before he finally passed away. And another issue was this: the CIA was really trying to make the case that Frank was just falling apart and he was having a mental breakdown. But according to his family, that just wasn't right. You know, Frank's wife and son said that sure, he was having a difficult time and he was thinking about retiring soon, but he was by no means suicidal. In fact, Frank was looking forward to life after the service and spending time with his loved ones that he regularly missed out on due to his commitment. And another one is a hotel switchboard operator, and now these are the people that connected incoming and outgoing phone calls. Now, this person stated that around the time that Frank had fallen, Lashbrook called Dr. Abramson and told him, "Doctor, he's gone." To which Abramson replied, "Well, that's too bad." Now, you tell me if that's the response of someone who actually gave two shits about this person. So it would have to be 22 years later that a committee finally uncovers all the atrocities that occurred with the MK Ultra project. And in those records was the account that Frank Olson and his associates were dosed with LSD without their consent or knowledge. Now, from this, the Olson family was able to at least file a wrongful death suit against the CIA, to which the government settled out of court for $750,000, which would be the equivalent to $3 or $4 million in today's money. Now, this is just one documented death that resulted from these illegal experiments on United States citizens. But the fact is, because the director Helm, having ordered all the records to be destroyed, no one was ever reprimanded for these crimes, and the number of people who actually died will never be known. Now, these are the main facts of MK Ultra, and I'll include all the links and all the released CIA records so you can see for yourself. But this is what really went down. So now, like we always do at this point of the episode, what we'll do is we'll take a look at what the theories are behind the case. And in this one, there's not much room for speculation. I mean, the CIA, after they were busted, they pretty much admitted, yes, these crimes did happen, and they officially apologized for the harm it caused to the communities, and that's pretty much it. Eric Olson, the son of Frank Olson, he kept calling for more investigations, and briefly they reopened the files again, but according to their inspector general, there was nothing further they could find to support any action. Now, they have all kinds of treaties and orders in place now that state that, someone cannot be tested or experimented on without their knowledge, without written consent. So there's that, at least, as late as it is, but at least it's there. But I guess the biggest fear that I can think of, I mean, it was very unfortunate that nothing was done about this when it was happening, and that really, really sucks. But nothing can be done about that. But what about now? How can we be sure that none of this is happening now? I mean, how could you ever really trust the government after being caught red-handed in something like this? I mean, and also when you think about the Montauk Project and the Philadelphia experiment, you know, how can you not think that those are real in some way? I mean, because the United States government are the main ones that are basically saying that those cases never happened. Well, they tried to say the same thing about MK Ultra, you know. And the crazy thing is, one of the crazy things that I found in my research was that Frank Olson was in charge of went down at Plum Island. And Plum Island is like a top secret center for disease control. I mean, just a short ways across from Montauk, New York. And they say that that center, that disease center for disease control, they said that that place was actually where the Lyme disease actually came from. It was created there, escaped there, and that's where it spread from. And so, I mean, there are a few other cases that kind of share similarities with MK Ultra and the Montauk Project, and we'll continue to look at those in upcoming episodes. But for now, we'll wrap it up, and I hope you enjoyed this case. And in my opinion, it's good to bring awareness to these topics, because whether they're happening nowadays, you know, we don't know for sure, but some people feel like they can make a case that they are. If you look at a little something called DARPA, they're working on basically implanting things in the mind that can, in your brain, that can link up with your phones or your computers or your machinery or this and that. And they're really advancing on that stuff, but a lot of people worry about if you do something like that, you're giving them access to taking control of your brain, your actions. I mean, or maybe they're not. You know, maybe it did end whenever MK Ultra stopped. But all I know is that talking about this case or cases like these is that it just helps us be aware. Okay, it helps us to remember that we need to ask questions, that we need to look out for ourselves. We need to be wary, because not everyone in this world has the best of intentions for you. Okay? And while they may be working towards that next greater good, innocent people can get ran the fuck over by their progress. And that's what these cases remind us of. Okay? Well, that's it for this one. And like I said, I'll list all the links in the show notes. And I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope to see you on the next episode. This is Rick with the Space City X-Files, and you guys take care.